Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 6th chapter. Galbraith screamed and woke up in a cold sweat in his bed. It seemed that in his nostrils stuck this vile smell, similar to the aroma of rotting meat and decomposed carrion. I was there at the birth. The inspector deliberately pronounced these words loudly and clearly in order to understand that he was no longer sleeping and was really at home. However, this did not make much sense, because the familiar interior of his apartment was revealed to his gaze. Here are his clothes hanging on the back of a chair, here is the remote control lying on the floor next to the television, and here is the window outside of which it was already light. But a delirious thought crept into Galbraith's mind that the creature from his nightmare did not disappear with the dream, but materialized somewhere in the depths of his room. "Come on out, newborn, try to devour your obstetrician," he shouted as loud as possible. But, as he thought, Kleisterkin did not crawl out from under the bed on its clawed paws, did not rush from the next room, and did not even burst straight out of the ceiling, for there has never been such a case where, upon waking up, a person dragged the inhabitants of his dreams into the real world. Getting out of bed, he immediately went to the bathroom. Looking at Owen's sleepy face, Galbraith wanted to shave. Without thinking twice, he soaked his cheeks and took the razor in his hands. However, as soon as the inspector brought the blade to the skin, he immediately felt a sharp pain. Putting the razor back in place, he washed his face and, watching as a red stream began to flow from the wound on his cheek, noted with displeasure that apparently he will have to continue to embarrass his colleagues with this stubble. And how did he manage to cut himself like that? Had his nerves completely gone from the nightmare, since his hands were shaking so much? There wasn't a scrap of food in the kitchen. Going to work hungry was not an option. Then Galbraith decided not to go to the department yet, but to run into a small establishment, which was located in the basement of a house on the other side of the street. Usually, local residents went there in order to knock back a glass of something intoxicating and, waving their arms, be drawn into a group of similar visitors and begin to twitch to the gaudy music that flowed from the loudspeaker hanging on the ceiling. But still, this establishment was famous not only for dances, there he could have a snack for a small amount of something tasty and, most importantly, high in calories. At least, this side was well known to Galbraith himself. He wasn't sure that anyone else would seriously go down the steps to this bar for a hot sandwich or a small plate of salad. Dressing for going out, Inspector continued to think about that grotesque baby creature from his nightmare. Remembering how the Kleisterkind, sensing a human, took a hunting stance, Galbraith concluded that it was the cub of some kind of predator. Apparently, the hunting instinct of this species was so developed that, in fact, as soon as they emerged from their mother's womb, these creatures were already sniffing out their potential victims. The only thing that was unclear was how they were supposed to move. How quickly that Kleisterkind attacked Inspector was a happy coincidence. The victim was very close to the place of birth, and this distance could easily be reached by jumping. But how did it hunt in its adult form? Although Galbraith was weak in biology, this did not stop him from believing that it was unprofitable for a predator to exist without strong hind limbs, because it was necessary to somehow develop speed in order to catch up with the fleeing prey. Apparently, the only way out for that newborn was the opportunity to fall into the hands of some compassionate scientists, who, having neutralized him for a while, installed mechanical prosthetic legs into his back part of the body. Galbraith painted this image in his head. Yes, he thought, such a creature would be worthy to come out from under the brush of Hans Geiger. By the time Galbraith had already gotten dressed and went outside, he had finally finished thinking about his essentially meaningless idea about the creature that he had seen in his dream. This morning the sun was still shining brightly in the sky, with not a cloud in it. It wasn't hot yet, but Inspector was pleased to walk down the steps leading to the bar. He wanted to find himself there as soon as possible, in the air-conditioned basement, but at a much more reasonable power level than in that grocery store where was the pig peanut. As soon as he crossed the threshold, Galbraith was immediately struck in his ears by the loud sounds of the piano. to the accompaniment of which the young singer's cheerful baritone sang with some unprecedented tenacity that there is something more than a party. The inspector thought that the owner of the establishment apparently did not give in to fashion trends if he played a song for his guests that was already 8 years old. He remembered how, when he first flew to America by plane, he was a hungry and thin student at the time, he heard the music of these guys playing in the airport. Then he did not attach much importance to it, but he remembered the intonation with which the singer, invisible to his eyes, sang something to the accompaniment of a cacophony of synthesizers. And now, being a police inspector, it seemed to Galbraith that there was some kind of message hidden in the lyrics of this band, and in the strange combination of sounds that made up their melodies, was the whole point of their collective creativity. There was no one at the round tables that stood in this basement room. This is understandable, most people come here to hang out to the music with bleary-eyed eyes at the end of the day, and not to have a snack before work, which is what Inspector wanted most now. Galbraith, who was already approaching the purple lights of the counter, had a thought flash through his head. It's quite funny that the owner played such upbeat music to an empty hall. With his long legs, the inspector did not need to stand on tiptoes to sit on the high three-legged stool. In the past, when he was still a loud boy, during physical education classes, during formation, the instructor often jokingly praised him, saying, "Be proud, guy, you very first in the line." Such attention to his otherwise modest person embarrassed little Galbraith, and he, blushing, did not answer these jokes. But those wonderful school years passed, and now no one with whom Inspector had to deal even thought of giving him a compliment in honor of his tall stature. This led Galbraith to sad reflections that school is not yet life in society. It would be much more accurate to compare it with a greenhouse, where, before being sown into the rough soil of real adult life, tiny shoots of future people grow in tiny pots and, according to a schedule, receive the necessary for them water, discipline, and light, knowledge. In his childhood, Galbraith often wanted the education system to undergo a radical overhaul, so that the young children and he himself, first of all, do not have to sit at a desk that spoils his posture in a stuffy classroom and, under the threat of grading a particular numbers, engage in senseless waste of paper and ink. As soon as Inspector took his place at the bar, the bartender, who seemed to be dozing all this time, immediately shook himself and, taking out a glass, asked his first visitor that morning. "What'll it be?" "Maybe brown horse," he meant whiskey. "No thanks, better gave me a warmed beer," Galbraith said imposingly. "One moment," answered the bartender. Keeping a stony expression on his face, man put away the glass and, placing a beer mug in front of the visitor, took out from somewhere under the counter a glass bottle full to the brim of a pale amber liquid. Having filled the mug to the brim, he placed the mug with the skill of a magician into the microwave oven behind him. Inspector did not take his eyes off the bartender. He was pleasantly fascinated by how gracefully he moved, how deftly he managed to handle all these glasses, bottles, and other attributes of this place. "Here's your order," said the bartender as he placed a slightly heated mug on the counter in front of the customer. Galbraith took a sip, and a pleasant, intoxicating warmth spread through his veins. Trying to drain the mug as slowly as possible, he began to imbibe alcohol with enjoyment. How long has it been since he went to this bar to treat himself to his favorite drink? Suddenly Galbraith shuddered. Carried away by drinking warmed beer, he did not notice at all what was happening around him. "Excuse me," as if emerging from a deep bottom to the surface, he asked in surprise. "Would you like to eat a little?" "We're having pizza today, the time is right," the bartender helpfully suggested. "Pizza?" Inspector did not seem to understand a word of the speech his interlocutor was making. "You're referring to breakfast," it finally dawned on him. "Yes, of course, give me a piece." The bartender nodded and retreated somewhere behind the counter. Galbraith, looking at the almost empty beer mug, remembered why he even stuck his nose into this establishment early in the morning. Yes, the morning meal is what he needs now. In fact, he shouldn't go across the whole city to his police department on an empty stomach. His train of thoughts was interrupted by someone's careful touch on his shoulder. Galbraith, who still did not feel quite fit from hunger, slowly turned to the one who had disturbed him. It was just a steward. The inspector looked him up and down with a dissatisfied glare. "Sorry, Mr. Young Man," said quietly. The steward was clearly uncomfortable with the fact that he had to disturb this gloomy man almost 2 heads taller than him. "What are you standing there for?" Inspector addressed him good-naturedly. Galbraith immediately stopped glaring at the guy, but he continued to shake slightly with fear. "Are you Inspector Galbraith?" Steward asked hesitantly. "Do we know each other?" The inspector began to remember whether he had seen this guy with a big nose and thin cheeks before. No matter how many times he came here, there was always an adult and lean man serving dishes. Galbraith concluded that his son must have come to work instead of him today. "No, mister, just one man asked you to answer the phone," the guy exhaled as he said his last words. Inspector glanced at the counter. The bartender was still not there. "Okay, hold on a minute. I ordered pizza, could you ask to wrap it to go?" he shouted to the steward, who was already leaving for the distant tables. "All right, I'll tell Mr. Anderson," referring to the bartender, guy answered without a hint of timidity. Times are shifting. Inspector thought about the young steward and, mentally wishing him success in his career, headed to the telephone booth. It was dark there, the light bulb hanging on the ceiling gave no light at all. The owner forgot to screw in a new bulb to replace the burnt one, Galbraith thought mechanically, raising the phone receiver to his ear. He was a little deaf from the music in the main room, so when he answered the phone with a businesslike "Inspector Galbraith is on a wire," he did not immediately hear the quiet voice of the caller. "Who are you? I'm sorry," he asked. "Skemore bothers you," a soothing aged voice came from the speaker. When Galbraith finally realized who the person on the other side of the line was, his heart involuntarily responded with a resounding beat to the sound of that name. "Forgive me, Mr. Chief Inspector, it's just hard to hear here," he began to make excuses. In this phone conversation, Galbraith, perhaps for the first time in his entire career as a police inspector, allowed himself to lie to Skemore. The lie was that in fact there was no sound reaching the telephone booth from the main room of this basement bar. Galbraith took such liberties in his conversation with Mr. Chief Inspector for the simple reason that he wanted to justify his own inattention and click those heels to the situation that allegedly interfered with him. Fortunately for him, Mr. Chief Inspector Skemore did not care about the conditions in which his subordinate was now. He, without listening to the end of Galbraith's pathetic excuse, made his request to him. "Galbraith, I would like to meet you." These seemingly harmless words of Chief Inspector made an unexpected impression on Galbraith. For a moment he felt a pain in his right ear, as if his eardrum had been pierced by the point of a very fine needle. It got dark in his eyes. "Roger, Mr. Chief Inspector," Galbraith answered, leaning his free hand against the wall of the telephone booth. I would prefer not to postpone the meeting. Do you have time?" "I'm all yours, Mr. Chief Inspector, it's only morning." "That's good, I don't want to delay this until tomorrow." "So you can?" "Yes, of course." "Excellent. You know where I live?" Galbraith wanted to answer "How would we know this?" but he restrained himself from this nervous outburst in time. But really, why on earth would he know the address of the Chief Inspector? And, for that matter, why don't they meet at the police department in his office? Why this conspiracy? Inspector was ready to find the address of the Chief Inspector among the heap of papers in the department, but his interlocutor did not let him finish. "Do you have something to write on?" "Wait a second." Galbraith began to look in his pockets. Yes, there it was, his small notebook, which he took out when he needed to write down someone's home number or address. "All is ready, dictate." Holding the receiver between his ear and shoulder, Inspector pressed the notepad against the wall of the telephone booth and, taking out a pen, prepared to write down. "So, write Rollo, 55. It's very close to Portland State University. Rollo Street, 55th house." Galbraith, trying not to drop the telephone receiver, wrote this address in large letters in his notebook. As he printed out the last digit, he heard Skymore ask, "Can you come immediately?" Inspector, closing the notebook and putting it in the inner pocket of his jacket, grabbed the receiver in his hands. "Yes, Mr. Chief Inspector, I will try to come to you as quickly as possible. Maybe you will be more comfortable in 1 or 2 hours? I can do it any second now." "Okay then, Galbraith. Waiting for you." He forgot to say goodbye. Mr. Chief Inspector Skymore had already finished the call. Galbraith returned the telephone receiver to its rightful place and, straightening his tie, left the telephone booth. Having crossed the threshold, he felt a slight tingling in his eyes. Standing in the darkness the entire conversation, he is somewhat unaccustomed to the light. Music was still playing in the bar room. The aggressive piano chords were joined by a strange industrial screech, as if a train was stopping its movement. Getting used to the daylight, Galbraith almost came face to face with the young steward. He, seeing the inspector entering the hall, stopped and, with a slight nod, pointing to the bar counter, cheerfully reported, "Pizza is ready, pick up your order." "Thanks to you." Galbraith wanted to address the steward by name. "My name is Lawrence Wilcox," the guy told him cheerfully. "My gratitude to you, Lawrence. Say hi to your father." "And what is your?" Now the guy wanted to know the name of his interlocutor. "Just call me Galbraith. Your dad always served me in this place." Galbraith walked up to the counter. On it lay a quarter of a thick flapjack wrapped in a sweaty plastic bag, which was generously smeared with ketchup. There was also grated cheese, baked at high temperature, under which were hidden 2 pieces of bacon. Sparsely, thought Inspector, for whom the mere sight of this food was enough to begin to reproach himself for falling for the advertisement of the bartender who was trying to push clearly stale goods to his customer. "How much do I owe you for this?" Galbraith, in no hurry to take the package in his hands, turned to the bored bartender. He took the price list in his hands and began to count in his head. At the same time, the veins on his forehead visibly swelled. Finally, he told the buyer the amount. Good grief, Galbraith thought, for one unfortunate glass of beer, albeit warmed, and a tiny piece of pizza, he needs to give the same amount of money as he usually spent on his purchases at the grocery store. It's not that the inspector was particularly greedy and stingy, no, Inspector just felt a little uncomfortable paying for food that takes 5 minutes to eat, the same amount of money as for supplies for 3 days. But nothing can be done. The rules of the market are the law. As a person working in the police, Galbraith knew this very well. Galbraith's mood was ruined. Throwing the money on the counter, he grabbed a sweaty plastic bag and, going up the steps, began to unwrap it as he went. His first impression of this slice of pizza was correct. This cheap semi-finished product was barely chewable and none of its components had any taste. Maybe the point was that while the inspector was talking on the phone, the pizza had time to cool down, lying on the bar counter, but Galbraith didn't want to justify himself to himself for his own stupidity, since he fell for the advertising, got what he deserved. Without slowing down, he finished his breakfast without the slightest sense of appetite. Having crumpled up the plastic bag, he threw it into the trash can, which just happened to be on his way when he passed by the wall of a building. But then suddenly the aftersound of some lively discussion reached his ears. Brushing the crumbs from his mustache, the inspector turned off the road into a small alley. There, in a small nook, 2 cars stood in the parking lot, a brand-new silver Buick Skyhawk and a nondescript Red Eagle Premier. 3 African Americans, dressed in some ridiculously large colorful suits for them, huddled around them. The 3 of them had their eyes hidden behind huge black glasses, and their hair covered their white caps with backward peaks. These are definitely fans of gangsta rap, Galbraith thought, slightly hiding. For some reason, he became interested in what these curious people were talking about in this secluded place. The tallest of this gang pointed his finger at the fat man standing opposite him and said angrily, "Call me jerk again, and I'll park your truck dead in your arse." The one to whom this remark was addressed pulled back and, turning to the short man standing on his left, said to him in a low voice, "Bud, I'd bust this shit right now." "He ain't gonna bust nothing," the tall African-American man said boastfully. "I got nuts bigger than him," the short one said calmly. "Whoa, country clod, maple syrup mutt." It was the tallest of the gang who raised his voice again, who after this remark suddenly pulled out a pistol shining silver from the pockets of his wide pants. The two who stood opposite him did not take long to wait and also pulled out their firearms. Unlike their opponent, their friends had black and compact Colts. "Yeah, you want some biscuits," shouted the short one. "You want some biscuits?" his fat friend echoed him. "Suck it down," yelled their opponent. Just a little more and they'll shoot each other with their pistols, Galbraith thought. Imagining how these three African Americans would simultaneously fall to the ground with holes in their heads, he laughed loudly. This saved the gang from their feud. They, forgetting about enmity, all turned in his direction as one. The muzzles of their guns were now facing the inspector. "What does this white-skinned asshole allow himself to do?" the tallest one screamed. "No doubt, he just hitting on us," the short man answered him. Galbraith, considering that it was now better to retreat, did not spend much time persuading himself. He, trying not to show fear at gunpoint of three pistols, slowly walked forward along the street. The fat man's cries of "Hey, where are you going?" could still be heard in his ears, but, strangely enough, not one of this warlike trinity followed him. Apparently, they just wanted to drive away the passerby who was interfering with their disassembly. Convinced that the three gangster rap fans were not going to follow him on his heels, Galbraith slowed down. Having satisfied his hunger, he no longer felt as sluggish as when he left the home. Now he was walking along a gradually narrowing street. The thought arose in his head that this nook in the center had not been rebuilt, probably since the 19th century, so unkempt were the walls of the awkward buildings in which the shop windows shone. The inspector walked next to the display window, behind which stood mannequins dressed in ball gowns, and, passing under a concrete arch, turned into a deserted passage. Now he didn't know where he was, but after yesterday Galbraith chose not to contact the metro. It seemed to him that if he went there again, this strange man would be waiting for him there again, who looked as two drops of water like Mr. Yonce, who was lying in the hospital. Deep in his thoughts, Galbraith noticed out of the corner of his eye that another person had appeared in the passage. It was a tall and thin man who gradually approached the inspector himself. The latter had no time to pay attention to a random passerby, but purely instinctively he tried to keep the person in his field of vision. Was it really the primitive instinct of a hunter, or a habit acquired during work in the police? But be that as it may, Galbraith decided that it was better not to relax, for in this passage, in which the further from the entrance it became darker, for some reason he felt uncomfortable being in it. The passerby was already very close. Raising his head, Galbraith noticed that he had slowed down a little. He thought, why would he? They simultaneously stopped a few steps away from each other. Inspector, trying to look at the stranger standing in the darkness of the passage, gradually stopped thinking about yesterday's incident in subway. Something was wrong with this man, Galbraith thought. What made him freeze in one place like that? Was it really out of surprise that besides him, someone else decided to follow this path? After waiting for half a minute, the inspector got tired of standing in one place and he moved forward, but suddenly the toe of his loafer came across something invisible, preventing him from moving further. Galbraith realized that this strange man was himself, for it was a reflection in a mirror that, for some incomprehensible purpose, had been brought to the end of a dead end. But this did not reassure the inspector. He took a couple of steps back and raised his hand up, thinking that the double in the mirror would repeat his movements. However, this did not happen. He suddenly felt the same feeling of unease in his blood vessels as yesterday when he saw Mr. Yonce's doppelganger. Galbraith again took a step forward and, trying to get in the man, touched the cold glass with his finger. No, it really was just a reflection in the mirror, but why doesn't it repeat the movements of himself, but seems to be frozen in the same pose in which Inspector himself was already a minute ago? Looking at this creepy double, Galbraith suddenly felt the ground under his feet begin to shake. What is this? An earthquake has started. The seriously alarmed inspector, shaking his head from side to side, began to feverishly look for a way out of the situation in which he found himself. All he wanted was to get out of this passage, but behind him, instead of a view of the street, there was only black darkness. Galbraith shouldn't have even tried to go in the direction he came from. Meanwhile, the tremor became more and more intense. Old plaster began to fall off the shabby walls. Galbraith had to step back. A brick fell right out of the ceiling and crashed to the ground, raising a little dust. This is already as much as 7 points, the inspector thought, estimating the level of the earthquake. If only He didn't have time to think through this thought. He was shaking so much that it was not possible to cast guesses calmly. In a panic, cutting circles around the tiny area of the passage, he again glanced at the mirror, which inexplicably did not crumble into pieces during this earthquake. The figure of his own reflection continued to stand in the same place and in the same pose, but Galbraith was much more worried about what was beginning to happen behind the back of the mirror double. From there, from a brightly lit street, a wave of dark red color suddenly surged. The liquid looked somewhat like seawater mixed with blood. Galbraith turned around. There was nothing behind him, just complete darkness. He turned back to the mirror. There, from the street clearly visible from here, a huge wave continued to approach his double. What in God's name is going on? Is this a hallucination? His thoughts were in chaos. The inspector no longer tried to draw any conclusions. He simply rushed about in this trap, like a beast corralled for slaughter. He looked at the mirror again and almost fainted. A wave of dark red liquid, which had already gotten close to Galbraith's reflection, rushed towards the inspector himself with a deafening sound of broken glass. He felt how this water flooded him from head to toe. His nose and mouth began to fill with liquid, which gave off a disgusting smell of blood. Trying not to suffocate, Galbraith began to frantically wave his arms, as if trying to swim to the surface, but he, unable to resist the power of this element, surrendered to the wave, which immediately knocked him to the ground. He woke up to someone's hands slapping his cheeks. It was difficult for him to open his eyes. It seemed that the eyelids were cramped. It's good that he's at least able to move his hand. He held it out somewhere forward and felt someone take his hand in theirs. I can't believe I'm losing you. Or maybe not. Finally, as someone's voice reached Galbraith's ears. He wanted to answer a person invisible to himself, but his tongue also seemed to be numb. He tried to move his neck. Everything seems to be fine, no vertebrae are broken. Stop bang the head, come on get up. It finally dawned on Inspector who the voice belonged to. Galbraith was finally able to open his eyes. He was lying on the ground, near the display window, behind which stood those same mannequins in ball gowns. And his friend bent over him, who, noticing that he had finally come to his senses, smiled. Looks like you was off, bud, said Farkraut with some reproach. Sorry, what's wrong with me? Galbraith asked him, slowly getting to his feet. Let's go sit in the shade. His friend ignored it. Because the heat is fierce. Taking the inspector by the shoulders, Farkraut headed towards a nearby bench. So strange, Galbraith thought, when I passed here even before this strange earthquake, I didn't see a single bench nearby. What really happened? Farkraut seemed to read his friend's thoughts and said, Yes, I'm going about my deals, and I see you standing in the alley, looking at some rappers. When you laughed and began to run away from them, I decided to follow you. You never know, I'll have to protect you from these Trinity. And I noticed that you turned into a dead end. Well, I think that my friend, out of fear, without understanding the road, went wherever his eyes looked. I follow you and see that you are running circles in front of the mirror, like a dog that wants to catch its tail. I run up to you, and you open your mouth and your eyes are so bulging. I figured that you'll be swinging. I couldn't find any other way to stop your madness other than to hit you over the head and drag you out here. Having finished his story, Farkraut exhaled and looked at Galbraith. You don't got a headache? His friend asked with concern. No, it doesn't hurt, answered the inspector. I just couldn't open my eyes or move my tongue. Probably numbness, or some sort of a paralysis. How did you even get into this condition? Maybe you injected yourself with something, huh? Go take your narcotics away somewhere else, Farkraut, you know me. With some resentment, Galbraith began to make excuses to him. What other word is there for it? Do you really want to convince me that you were so scared of those 3 African Americans that you decided to hide from them in some dead end and, thinking that no one would see you there, you gave vent to your nerves? I'm not going to persuade you, Bud. In this case, tell me what you yourself felt at that moment. I swear narcotics have nothing to do with that, Galbraith began. I just left the bar and, on my way to Rollo Street, I happened to pass by an alley where 3 gangsta rappers were preparing to shoot each other over some trifle. I laughed to distract them from this idea, and calmly walked on. And, not knowing that this was a dead end, he entered the passage. But I'm afraid you may not believe what happened next. I'll believe you, don't worry. Okay, continue. Okay. In the passage, I came close to the mirror and suddenly noticed that my reflection did not react to my movements. And then I felt an earthquake begin. I wanted to run back, but everything was blocked behind me. And then a wave of blood poured out of the mirror onto me. Choking, I lost consciousness. Thank you for, as it turns out, following me all this time. Don't consider me your guardian angel, buddy. Well, you've taken a great trip. You still think it's a narcotic? I don't think so anymore. I just can't describe your incident any other way. Good, come quickly. Farkraut, wiping his hands directly on his jacket, rose from the bench. After him, after a little hesitation, Galbraith stood up. They headed towards the exit of this alley, approaching the road where cars were racing at full speed. Suddenly the inspector stopped. Noticing his friend's puzzled look, he replied. Wait a second, I think my shoe is untied. He sank down and suddenly it dawned on him that he was wearing loafers. God, why did he feel like he was wearing new shoes now? Galbraith looked up and suddenly became speechless. Farkraut, with his head thrown back, fell slowly to the ground. Several holes were clearly visible on his white shirt, from which blood began to ooze. Rushing to help his friend, the inspector noticed a black sedan driving past them, from the back door window of which someone's gloved hands were pulling into the cabin a long barrel of a weapon similar to a semi-automatic gun. What happened after, Galbraith no longer remembered because of the shock that gripped him at that moment from the loss of someone close to him. It seems that some spectacled guy with curly hair then called an ambulance, then the orderlies arrived and put Farkraut's already motionless body on a stretcher and, in front of Galbraith's eyes, took him away in an unknown direction. He also remembered that, trying not to give way to tears, he slowly walked somewhere from that place, and some girl in a blue dress, from under which a pink sweater was visible, loudly said, "Why is this a Jussie crying?" He remembered how her father, whose face amazed him with unusually long cheekbones, holding daughter's hand, told her reproachfully, "Shelby, how many times do I have to tell you, do not comment on passers-by." Inspector, who was seriously embarrassed by the words out of the mouths of Babe, decided to get into a taxi so that no one would see his rare tears. Despite such a shock, he, being a policeman, felt that he needed to be responsible for his words to the senior rank, so, settling into the back seat, Galbraith said to the young guy behind the wheel, "Rollo, 55, and, trying to suppress the memory of his friend's frozen pale face, he threw his head back on the seat, much like the doppelganger he saw yesterday on the subway. By the time the taxi driver brought the inspector to the small but neat one-story house of Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore, the time was already approaching evening. Galbraith, getting out of the taxi, at parting gave the driver a tip and, approaching a low wooden fence, pressed the bell button. A couple of minutes later the gate opened and Scamore, who was dressed in discreet blue pajamas, which made it difficult to think that this short, elderly man was none other than the chief inspector of Portland's police himself, let the guest in. The owner, apologizing to Galbraith for his appearance, according to him, he had just woken up from a lunchtime nap, walked him to the living room and, pointing to two large armchairs upholstered in green fabric, invited Galbraith to sit down. The latter did not remain in debt, sitting down in the chair that was closest to the fireplace behind. he began to wait until Mr. Chief Inspector pulled out from a luxurious sideboard a box of fresh cigars, as well as a bottle of some dark brown liquid and 2 glasses. "Now, let's just get right into it," Skymore said in a cheerful tone, looking at the pleasure with which guest puffed on his cigar. "Well, what's at stake of our today's meeting?" Galbraith had almost completely gotten rid of the oppressive mood caused by the incident at Cryptic Passage. "Yes, this is it." Mr. Chief Inspector nodded to the bedside table that stood on his left hand. Galbraith looked in that direction more closely. On it lay a familiar stack of white photocopied sheets. "What, are you want me to recite to you by heart everything that is written there?" Galbraith said with some mischief. At the same time, he took another puff, not failing to note to himself that these cigars were definitely excellent. "Well, Galbraith, there's no need for that. I already know this document perfectly from line to line," his interlocutor answered with some mystery in his voice. "I'm more interested in what you think of its content." Mr. Chief Inspector Skymore looked carefully at his guest. He felt a little uneasy. Time and time again this man looks at him as if he is trying to penetrate his flesh and blood and read his thoughts. Galbraith put out his cigar and, putting it in an ashtray on the small table, said, "Forgive me generously, Mr. Chief Inspector, but whatever that is." He tried to find words with which he wanted to express his complete ignorance of what was written on those sheets by the hands of his friend. "So, what's next?" Skymore tilted his head slightly. I haven't read the Farkraut's case," Galbraith blurted out. His subconscious was preparing for the fact that these words of his would be followed by some kind of punishment. Maybe they'll scold him, maybe they'll just start reproaching him for laziness. But Mr. Chief Inspector Skymore heard these words, simply lit a new cigar and, blowing out a ring of smoke, said almost peacefully, "It's nice enough. We'll be better check it out already under the influence." "What? Under what influence?" Galbraith wanted to ask what Skymore meant by this, but he, pouring the liquid into glasses, offered it to his guest. "Be sure to try Pim's fruit liqueur. Ideally, you should drink it with some fruit, but I like it on its own. I hope you appreciate it in value." Galbraith picked up the glass and raised it to his mouth. Subtle taste of spices. "Yes, of course, Mr. Chief Inspector will not drink any Applejack." Something that is familiar, having tried a new drink for the first time, Galbraith fell into some kind of state of ecstasy. "There's England spirit," Skymore winked at him, taking a sip. England scent, Galbraith, who found it difficult to describe the sensation that gripped him, agreed with this definition. "By the way, why did you decide to leave your fatherland?" Mr. Chief Inspector suddenly asked a question that was unexpected for his interlocutor. Why ask you?" Galbraith raised his head in shock. "Just idle curiosity." Having finished the first glass, Skymore was already pouring himself a new portion. "Would you like me to entertain you during your evening apéritif?" As if addressing a friend, Galbraith said. "I understand your state of mind." Skymore decided to hush up this topic. "Let me share with you my thoughts on the Farkraut's case. After all, your friend was a remarkable person, and I was always interested to know how he expressed his thoughts on paper." Muttered his guest. Before Galbraith's eyes flashed again the facial features of Farkraut, who was near death. You are not satisfied with what I said about your colleague in the past tense?" Mr. Chief Inspector again gave his interlocutor a piercing look. "No, everything suits me," said Galbraith. He thought to himself that did the Chief Inspector manage to get information about that Farkraut is no longer alive. "Well, then it's a good," Skymore replied. "Then let me begin." And, putting the glass on the bedside table, Mr. Chief Inspector began to express to the guest his impressions of the material he had read. With his gestures, intonation and his appearance, he strongly reminded Galbraith of his philosophy teacher, whose lectures he had attended almost a decade ago. The inspector met the next morning in bed in his tiny apartment. The details of how he got to his home yesterday, when he finished an audience at the home of Mr. Chief Inspector Skymore, completely flew out of his head. Apparently, the fruit liqueur that they drank together then had a detrimental effect on Galbraith's memory. Getting out of bed, he walked to his desk. A bundle of photocopied material of his friend's investigation lay in the same position in which it had been placed 2 days ago. Looking at these sheets, Galbraith recalled excerpts from yesterday's speech by Chief Inspector Skymore. He seemed to say something about Farkraut's extraordinary talent for extracting meaning from things, which to any other person would seem irrelevant to this or that situation. In addition, the young inspector impressed Skymore by the fact that with just words he managed to describe his adventures in the places where the deaths of those 4 occurred in such a way that the chief inspector, in his own words, ended up there and saw them with his own eyes, despite the fact that he had never been there was not. Big deal, the usual talent of a writer, thought Galbraith. He knew that his friend always showed promise of becoming a writer, but alas, doom decreed his life in such a way that he had to become a police inspector. And then, against his will, Inspector's eyes filled with tears. He again watched as his friend slowly fell to the ground, as his face, on which the expression of horror was frozen, turned pale right before his eyes, and as his pulse ceased to be felt. Galbraith remembered that his friend was taken away in an ambulance, but where he was placed and what his final fate was, he could no longer know. And he didn't want to, because he was afraid that if he saw the cold corpse of his friend again, he might lose his mind with grief. It would be better if that event at the passage will remain for him the last moment that will be associated with closest friend. By the way, regarding the cryptic passage. Inspector, having washed his face and went into the kitchen, began to analyze that moment, immovable reflection, earthquake and bloodwave. If he is to believe Farkraut's words, then in fact Galbraith was simply rushing around in a panic at a dead end with a mirror, that is, those visions were not real events. His rational mind told him that there was no point in trying to understand the visions themselves, instead, he needed to get to the bottom of what caused them. Putting a pan of sausages on the stove, Galbraith decided to build on what his friend told him then, narcotics. The inspector had never taken a single mind-altering drug in his entire life. He was as sure of this as in, 2 and 2 are 4. This means that there was a possibility that he took the psychotropic medication unknowingly. This could be possible if in the food he ate before, someone had quietly added a dose of some hallucinogen. Having put forward this hypothesis, Galbraith suddenly remembered how he read in some book, if his memory served him right, it was written on the other side of the Iron Curtain, that in France there was a case where an anti-drug specialist discovered hashish in a pie that was served at an immodest price in one restaurant. And what was even worse, that before this case was revealed, gourmets from all over the resort where that restaurant was located had been buying this delicacy for several years. Galbraith still remembered the name of that drug dish given in the text, the X-Pies. Involuntarily, Inspector began to remember that book. Small, slightly larger than his own notebook, bound in green cardboard, titled The Word About Arrest. On its pages, the author spoke of advertising as a kind of child of Satan, which supposedly seduces mere mortals into the path of sins. Apparently, Galbraith thought, it is typical for a resident of a communist power, talk about capitalism as a kind of satanic discipline. Having drained the water from the pan and placed the sausages on a plate, Galbraith returned to his analysis of what influenced yesterday's incident in the passage. So, narcotics and food. What did he eat then? Armed with a knife and fork, Inspector carefully cut the sausages into slices. Yesterday he left the house hungry. At a bar where he went for breakfast, he fell for the bartender's advertisement and ordered pizza. In fact, it turned out to be a disgusting semi-finished product that had neither taste nor smell. A worthy candidate for putting a pill or two of lysergic acid diethylamide in there. But for what reason? The bartender knew Galbraith well, who often visited his establishment, one might say, from the very first day he moved into the house on About Street. Did Mr. Anderson suddenly come up with the idea to drug his client that day? Or even not just him, who knows how many people after him then ordered that pizza? This is the case if the narcotic was added at the food preparation stage, but then again, why would cooks suddenly mix psychotropic compound into the dough? Anything can happen, of course. Then the inspector's thoughts turned to beer, which he also ordered from the same bar. The bartender pulled that bottle from under the counter, which even then seemed somewhat suspicious to Galbraith. Unlike pizza, it could easily have added a pinch of hallucinogen to the beer and, after waiting for it to dissolve, serve it to the client. Here it could also play into the hands of that inspector asked to warm up the drink even if grains of the substance were still visible in the cold beer, then with heating they finally went into liquid. But again, a regular customer and a narcotic, this somehow doesn't fit together. After eating all the sausages, Galbraith put the says on the stove. He liked to end breakfast with a mug of an invigorating drink. God be with him, with this bar, he thought. But how else could the hypothetical narcotic enter his body? He came up with the idea, which smacked of schizophrenia, that the mind-altering drug was in the very decanter that was standing on the table in the office of Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore at the moment when Farkraut was speaking about his investigation. The delusion of such a hypothesis was that, as Galbraith thought, a drug had not yet been invented that did not manifest itself immediately after entering the body, but only the next day, and even in a very suitable place for this, in some kind of dead end, far from strangers. Inspector removed the says from the stove in time. The foam bubbling from the neck almost flooded the burner. Having filled a small coffee cup to the brim, Galbraith began to wait until the drink cooled a little, because there was no pleasure in burning his tongue when the main thing in coffee, after the aroma, of course, is its indescribable, subtle taste. Galbraith never liked the tea, he even despised it, calling it herbal decoction for people have no taste. He reached into the refrigerator for cream. Alas, there was not a drop left on the bottom of the cardboard package. Nothing can be done, he'll have to drink empty coffee. Inspector was stumped in his analysis of what led him to that hallucination. His overly rational thinking did not allow him to admit mystic, and the drug theory fell apart like a glass vase falling to the floor. Galbraith, having drunk the first cup of coffee, was already reaching for the says in order to pour more, but a call from the next room forced him to get up from the table. He went to the telephone and picked up the receiver. Hello. Go outside, a car waiting for you downstairs, a voice unknown to him hurriedly minted words. I fear you are making a mistake, Galbraith began displeasedly, who was not at all happy that he was distracted from drinking coffee. There's no mistake, Inspector, the caller interrupted him. Dispatch call from Parkrose neighborhood, they say suicide. Paramedics have already arrived at the scene and are waiting for the police. Fine, give me a minute. With these words he hung up. The caller did not introduce himself to Galbraith, but judging by the fact that he addressed him as Inspector, this was a person clearly connected with the police, and further words only confirmed this. Going out into the hallway, Galbraith sat down on a stool and began to put on patent leather shoes, because he decided that for the sake of an important moment it was worth wearing shoes that were more impressive than loafers. Remembering the coffee that was cooling in the says, he sighed and, leaving the apartment, ran down the stairs. At the entrance stood a familiar square sedan. The inspector opened the back door and sat down next to the cheerful and rosy-cheeked doctor. Making the sound of a police siren, the Crown Victoria took off. Galbraith made himself comfortable and glanced out the window. The city had already woken up, children were already running along the streets, cyclists were riding, and occasionally people with loaded carts came across. Oh yeah, he thought, it turns out that while I was getting up, having breakfast and drinking coffee, everyone else had long since gone to work, and I'm the only sleepyhead. Music was playing inside the car. Galbraith immediately noticed that this was a song from the same album, which was already 8 years old. Only this was a different track. If the song that was playing in the bar was about parties, then in this one, to the accompaniment of very outdated synthesizers, the young singer, with some uncharacteristic insinuating intonation, told the listeners that he was counting his last minutes under the orange sky. This song is out of date, he thought of the Red Giant, which by its very existence terrified the entire capitalist world, has already de facto ceased to exist. The inspector, having read in the newspapers a month ago about the Soviet coup d'état attempt, already realized that the end of this tense confrontation was not far off. America, Great Britain and other countries belonging to North Atlantic Treaty Organization no longer had to fear that a nuclear apocalypse was about to begin. Galbraith was distracted from these political thoughts by the unexpected no sex to his ears, which crept into the lyrics of a song playing on the radio. Yes, in their youth these guys knew how to write texts that could surprise their listeners. What, the music is bad, the doctor sitting on Inspector's left noticed his neighbor's displeased grin. No, the song is pretty much okay, only its lyrics are shamelessly outdated. Having woken up from his trance, Galbraith turned to his interlocutor. I'll ask the driver to switch channels, said the doctor and, without waiting for his answer, turned to the Sergeant Sausher who was driving. Now, instead of music, there is an advertisement for bug spray on the radio. The announcer listed the advantages of the insect repellent with such extraordinary joy, as if he had inhaled laughing gas before the broadcast. Well, that's better, the doctor leaned back in his seat and winked at Inspector. To be honest, I really don't care, Galbraith looked out the window. They had already left the city and were driving along the highway, on the sides of which there were trees, and only rare houses occasionally broke the monotony of this landscape, interspersed with rare power poles. There was something peaceful in contemplating this beauty. However, at the moment the inspector did not feel much pacification. If you're thirsty, I will give you a drink. The doctor pulled out a backpack from under the seat and began rummaging through it. What have you got for me? Galbraith, who still couldn't come to terms with being pulled away from his coffee, perked up a little. Take a hold. The interlocutor handed him a shiny vacuum flask. Huh, nice. Having opened the lid, Galbraith's nose felt such a pleasant smell for him. Coffee with? Sugar, just sugar, the doctor, impressed by the inspector's smile, said this with obvious pleasure. Galbraith did not really like sweet coffee, personally, he always drank it only with cream and without sweeteners. But in this situation he had no choice. He placed the lid on his lap and brought vacuum flask to his lips. Drink it down, I had a very substantial breakfast, said the doctor, looking at how greedily Inspector swallows the liquid with brown sugar. Thank you very much, Galbraith answered. He closing the vacuum flask with a lid, Inspector decided that it would be better to leave some coffee for the return trip. Having given it to the doctor, Galbraith looked at the man sitting next to the driver. He did not see his face, but judging by his broad shoulders, the stranger was clearly a man with an unbending will. Don't you know who this is? Inspector turned to his neighbor. He's from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, said the doctor. Then he leaned over and whispered in Galbraith's ear, a stern guy, but a little twitchy. The FBI man, whose sensitive ears had heard the doctor's remark, turned back. Galbraith saw the arrogant face of a young man whose features seemed to be carved from stone. He, clearly restraining himself from shouting at the good-natured doctor, just glared at him from under his thick eyebrows. Yes, Galbraith thought, this guy will not tolerate comments addressed to him. How do they even hire such people to the authorities? His nerves are totally shot. Mr. Matt McLaren, I would advise you to refrain from criticism of my person. Galbraith heard the same voice that distracted him from breakfast. We should have introduced you to our inspector somehow, the doctor answered him cheerfully, on whom the stern glance from under his brows had no effect. The man reached at Galbraith, who was sitting directly behind him. The inspector wanted to rudely say to him, "What are you staring at, shaver?" but he suppressed this desire. No, he definitely didn't like this guy in a strict black suit and thick eyebrows. We have reached our destination. Suddenly the booming bass of the young Sergeant Sausher, who was sitting behind the wheel, was heard. They got out of the car, and Galbraith, straightening the hem of his jacket, looked around. After the urban look of the center, it was a little unusual to be in the suburbs. No tall buildings, no bright signs, no mess of cars, only rare 1- and 2-story cottages surrounded by wooden fences, tall grass with trampled paths and luxurious green crowns of trees. This rural idyll was slightly spoiled by an ambulance and a couple of police sedans standing nearby. Apparently the man from the Federal Bureau of Investigation they came here with was only an aide to the head of the response service who had already arrived here. Galbraith, standing by the car and looking at the two-story house, for a moment remembered his childhood years spent in Gloucester. Father's wooden house, apple orchards, river. "Come now, Inspector," Matt lightly pushed Galbraith on the shoulder. "Come into the house." All four passed through the threshold of the gate. An elderly woman with a white scarf on her head ran out to meet them. "At last, a professional from FBI," she shouted joyfully. Galbraith, standing next to the doctor, looked at like a man in a black jacket, giving this village simpleton a stern look, walked past her. The woman seemed surprised by that behavior of person from Federal Bureau of Investigation. She stopped in her tracks, looking after the man entering the house. "Can you explain to us what exactly happened?" Galbraith turned to this woman. She, hearing the inspector's voice, stopped looking at the house and quickly turned to the speaker. At the same time, her face, furrowed with deep wrinkles, expressed some bewilderment mixed with annoyance. "And you are an inspector, as I understand it," she said with some uncertainty. Apparently, it was a surprise to her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would also send an ordinary policeman along with their man. At the first glance at her, Galbraith had the feeling that like she thinks the cops are worse than the FBI guys, at least that's what one might think, looking at her face, which expressed barely concealed contempt for the one who appeared before her at that very moment. "I was called here like everyone else," after a slight hesitation, Galbraith answered. By everyone Galbraith meant both the response service and himself, the FBI agent and the doctor. The latter, by the way, at that time stood with his hands on his hips next to him, and with a slight grin looked at the woman with a scarf on her head, who, however, did not pay much attention to him, but simply raised her hands to her temples and took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. After that, she looked up at Galbraith. "All right, I got it," she said with such a tone when in fact nothing is got. "Anyway, I'm walking past the Yonce's house and I hear a shot." "We should sit down and discuss it calmly," Matt interrupted her. The woman, looking strangely at the doctor, went forward into the house. He immediately followed her. Galbraith, hearing a familiar surname, hesitated a little and ended up being the last to enter. They found themselves in the spacious hallway of a typical country cottage. There was a bench along the wall, above which hangers with clothes hung in several rows, a carpet lay on the floor, and vases with fresh flowers were placed in the corners of the hallway. "Are we to remove our shoes before entering the house?" Matt asked cheerfully. "The weather is nice outside now, this is not necessary," the woman answered boredly. They went into the hall. On the left hand there was a staircase leading to the second floor, on the left there was a door leading to the living room. What immediately caught eye was a large mirror in a gilded frame, which hung on the wall near the threshold. The general decoration of the house suggested that the owner was a rich man. So, he thought, here is the house, where it all happens. He was torn from his thoughts by an old voice. A woman with a white scarf on her head began to talk about what had happened. "So, I heard a shot and, sensing something was wrong, I ran to the Yonces. Fortunately the gate and the front door were open." "Did this seem strange to you?" Galbraith asked the woman, referring to her last words about the doors. "Of course. I thought that robbers had broken into their house." "Okay, go ahead." "I run into the house, and there, right next to this mirror, Yvette is lying on the floor." The woman with a white scarf on her head suddenly fell silent. Apparently, this picture was still standing before her eyes. It was not difficult for Galbraith to guess that the witness had Mrs. Yonce in mind. "Let me guess, the lady of the house shot herself with a pistol," said the inspector. "That's right," the woman's voice trembled. Parabellum was lying on the floor in front of her. "Did you see the bullet mark on her body?" I saw blood flowing from her forehead." The woman pulled out a handkerchief and put it to her eyes. It seemed like she was about to cry. "Okay, madam," the inspector expected her to say her name, but she did not hear his words. "Well, what we are and will stagnate," suddenly a stern voice rang out. From the bathtub, located directly opposite the entrance to the house, an FBI man came out and approached the trinity crowded around the mirror. Galbraith looked at him. The agent's words, or rather, the intonation with which he pronounced them, seemed to him somewhat inappropriate in this situation. But the witness, hearing his voice, immediately blew her nose and hid her handkerchief. "So, that you have taken hereafter?" Galbraith asked. "I immediately went upstairs where the phone was," the woman continued. "I called the police, they arrived with paramedics." "Has Mrs. Yonce's body been taken away yet?" "You should have seen their car outside," the witness answered somewhat rudely. "Very well, I understand." Suddenly Galbraith felt tired. He got tired of asking questions for no reason, as if the whole mood of the professional inspector had disappeared somewhere. He turned to the man from Federal Bureau of Investigation. "They were obviously waiting for you here more than me, so I'll get out of your way." The agent, who had previously stood quietly behind the woman, looked at Galbraith with some kind of contemptuous look and took over the inspector's initiative. That is, he began to ask questions with a hurried intonation to a woman with a white scarf on her head, and the latter was clearly much more pleasant to communicate with him, which was clearly audible in her much more confident voice than before. Galbraith went towards the bath, to rinse your hands and face after a long car ride, but, without taking even 3 steps, he suddenly stopped in place. He felt someone's intent look on him. His whole body froze, as if in a daze. But after a couple of seconds this strange paralysis passed. Galbraith turned his head and looked to the left, where there was a staircase to the 2nd floor, covered with a fleecy carpet. There was a little girl standing on the top steps. Holding the carved wood railing with her left hand, she looked down with some apprehension at the policemen gathered in the hall. She was wearing a brown velvet dress with a pattern of orange circles, ending just above the knees, which gave the baby's figure a touching and homely look. Her black hair was styled with such elegant simplicity that Galbraith immediately made the assumption that she was apparently getting ready to go for a walk, but the sight of unfamiliar men gathered in her house made her freeze in place in indecision. Woman with a white scarf on her head, who previously answered questions from an FBI agent, noticing the girl, she immediately turned to her and smiled. "Don't be afraid, it's just the police, come down," she shouted to the child in a soothing tone. After that, woman headed towards the exit of the house, throwing over her shoulder. "Well, I got to go, messers, I think the young lady can tell you anything else." The FBI agent looked after her with obvious annoyance. Then he turned to the baby girl, who, meanwhile, was already slowly descending the stairs into the hall. With his arms folded across his chest, he slightly pushed the toe of his shoe forward and muttered inaudibly. So. Galbraith, noticing some uncertainty on the face of the man from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, thought that he had apparently never had to interrogate children. The girl finally came down the stairs. It was clear from her face that she was afraid to come closer. Galbraith had a fleeting thought that she had apparently never seen strangers in the house. Well, yes, what kind of guests could her pharmaceutist father have, he wondered. "Your name," suddenly the voice of an FBI agent pierced the silence. The little girl pulled back, she was apparently frightened by the eagerness with which this tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face addressed her. And he, lowering his hands, repeated his question again. Notes of dissatisfaction began to grow in his voice. Galbraith, who was already beginning to feel sorry for this unpleasant man, decided that he would have to come to his rescue, since otherwise they won't succeed to get a word out of this girl. Inspector, trying to walk as slowly as possible, moved towards the child. She, turning her gaze from the agent to himself, began to back away to the stairs. Galbraith stopped and, trying to give his voice as gentle an intonation as possible, addressed her. "Don't be scared, sweetie. We just want you to give us the essence of things." "Good." The girl, who a moment ago was already preparing to run up the stairs, relaxed at the first sounds of Galbraith's baritone voice and even took a couple of steps towards him. The inspector exchanged glances with the FBI agent, as if telling him, "Look at me do it." "Will you tell us what your name is?" he asked the child. The girl stopped moving her head around and looked at Galbraith. Her eyes of an indefinite dark color with some kind of cunning squint looked the inspector up and down and, as it seemed to him, sparkled brightly. She slightly bent her knees and tilted her head a trifle. "Delia," the inspector heard her gentle voice. Having said this, the girl brushed aside a strand of hair that had fallen on her face and smiled at the inspector with her charming smile. Hearing her name, Galbraith involuntarily remembered Farkraut, or rather, his investigation. After all, Delia is a name of Greek origin. "Listen, Delia, you won't say a few words about how your mom, well, that's the most," he began. "Ascended unto heaven," Delia said suddenly. "Did she tell you that herself?" Galbraith was stunned by her remark. "Yes," the girl nodded. "Mommy took Daddy's gun and told me not to cry when she will ascend unto heaven." Lord, what was going on here, Galbraith thought. It feels like I'm not the only one who's been went mad lately. "Did your mother never ascended before?" When she giving herself injections, a man from the FBI intervened. Delia gave him a frightened look. "Do not listen to him, he was only joking," the inspector immediately began to calm her down. Galbraith threw an angry look over his shoulder. "Don't talk nonsense, fool." But the agent either ignored the silent message of inspector or just did not take it into account. Instead, he quickly walked up to Delia. "Tell me, where is your father?" man said loudly. The little girl stepped back. The agent came even closer. "Do you know where he might be now?" he continued, raising his voice. Galbraith realized that he needed to put an end to this so that sedition would not occur. He rushed at the agent with the agility of an athlete. He began to break away from the inspector's grasping hands, continuing to look at the child. "Why won't you speak?" the man was already screaming. "Easy, tiger," Galbraith hissed angrily in his ear. "If you don't know how to work with children and only attack them, then stay where you are and don't interfere. It's clear?" Delia laughed as if she had witnessed the funniest thing that could ever happen. Dimples appeared on her plump cheeks and her eyes sparkled. Apparently, the sight of a mustachioed middle-aged man clinging tightly to a young guy had about the same effect on her as a fight between two monkeys at the zoological garden. She could be understood. A little girl would never dare to attack an adult full of life and energy, towering over her like a mountain. The sound of her gentle laughter had a beneficial effect on the man from Federal Bureau of Investigation. When Galbraith released him from his grip, the broad-shouldered guy with a confused look sank onto the bench that stood in the hallway. The rosy-cheeked medic Matt, who had been quietly standing by the mirror all this time, involuntarily clapped his hands. "Bravo, Mr. Inspector, bravo," he exclaimed with delight. Galbraith couldn't help but smile at Matt before he looked at Delia. The girl stopped laughing, and her face took on a calm, almost peaceful expression. "So, Delia, your mother's got the gun. What did she do before that?" Inspector addressed the child. Delia looked up at Galbraith and raised her hand to her head, apparently trying to remember what happened in the morning. About 3 seconds later she replied. "Before this, Mommy was lying in bed." "Are you saying that?" the agent began, but Inspector, shaking his finger at him, turned to Delia. "I went to her and asked when Dad would be back. She said she didn't know and wept." The pieces of the puzzle all start to come together, thought Galbraith. The girl did not know where her father was, but her mother was already aware that he had been in an accident. "Yeah. I began to console Mommy, but she asked me to go for a walk. I didn't want to leave her alone, but I obeyed," Delia said. "And when did you return?" asked Galbraith. "After half an hour. I went home and saw Mommy standing in front of the mirror. I asked her what she was doing, but she raised hand with the gun to head." "You said a minute ago that she told you something before that," the inspector couldn't resist. "When Mommy fell, I ran to her and she whispered to me not to cry." "I don't trust it," thought Galbraith. Usually, after being shot in the head, a person is unable to utter a word. "Was it true?" he asked little girl. Her voice was almost inaudible. "But I understood from her eyes what she wanted to say," answered the child. Okay, Delia. Inspector straightened his back and thought about what to do next. Baby girl, having told him everything she knew, now simply stood still and batted her long eyelashes. Do you have relatives in the center? Then it dawned on Galbraith. Relatives? Delia didn't seem to understand what she was told. Well, uncle, aunt, grandmother, he began to list. I only have dad and mom, the girl answered. From now on, it's only dad, the inspector said gloomily. Appositely, when will he come? The child perked up a little. He's sick, he needs to get treatment. Galbraith avoided a direct answer. In fact, it was the honest truth. Galbraith had not heard from the Adventist Medical Center, so he believed that her father was already on the road to recovery. And when will he be cured? Delia kept asking. I can't say, the disease is serious, he rasped. The inspector thought where else the child could be assigned to keep an eye on her. They can't leave Delia alone in this house, where before her eyes died a person close to her.